40 kilometres off the Tasmanian coast, CSIRO researchers are preparing to take a close look at a world few humans have ever seen. This year, for the first time, Australian engineers have developed a camera strong enough to be dragged across the ocean floor and film deep underwater. Nearly a kilometre below the boat, as the camera scrapes over the rocks, it's throwing out the first light this underwater world has ever seen.
It's amazing, it's so clear, isn't it?
The orange fish here are called orange roughy, and some of them could have been swimming here undisturbed since the middle of last century.
Well, orange roughy is obviously a very old fish. It doesn't mature until about 30 years old. It can live perhaps to 150 or even older, and the average age of a fish in a fishery might be about 60 years old.
This seabed is so deep that red light doesn't penetrate. So down here, the orange roughy are usually almost invisible. And until recently, that camouflage has been enough to protect them. But in the last 20 years, the world's fishing industry has discovered orange roughy. And it's found that this deep-living and mysterious fish is boneless, bland tasting and perfect for freezing. Orange roughy is now the most popular fish on American dinner tables, and it's become one of the world's most fragile resources.
It's a resource that we don't get a second chance on. If a resident roughy population is overfished chronically, it means you've got a lag of half a century at least for it to bounce back. So it's a resource that we have to treat very carefully.
Australian scientists are still trying to discover exactly how long orange roughy live and how they breed. What they do know is that roughy don't mature until they're about 30 years old, and that the way the fish spawn makes them extremely vulnerable to fishing.
Yeah, it's a spent female.
Orange roughy spawn in the same place each year, usually around the rocky sides of underwater hills. For several weeks, thousands of tons of fish will cluster tightly together. It makes them an easy target. And it's meant that all over the world, when breeding grounds have been found, fishing has boomed and then busted almost as quickly. In Australia, the gold rush began a decade ago, when the first breeding ground was found at St Helens off Tasmania. For 2 seasons, dozens of trawlers were queuing up, dropping their nets and filling them in minutes.
Well, St Helens, there was no limits in the early days on how many boats could fish it. It was just open slather and everybody just went as hard as they could. Filled up, went back, filled up, went back.
The catches were so huge that nets broke and processing plants couldn't work fast enough. Soon, thousands of tons of roughy were being dumped.
Just take a photo, man, I'll jam the camera up yard.
It became obvious that the fishery wouldn't survive if the plunder continued. St Helens taught a tough lesson and forced major changes. These days, the Australian roughy industry is one of the most highly regulated in the world. But now, Australia's resolve to keep its fisheries sustainable is being threatened. In the last 2 years, a new roughy breeding ground has been discovered, just over 200 nautical miles south of Tasmania. It's called the South Tasman Rise, and it could be one of our richest fisheries. But the problem is that the South Tasman Rise cuts right across Australia's territorial border. It makes the orange roughy what is called a straddling stock. And that puts the fish into a new and grey area of international law. An area where Australia can regulate its own fishermen, but can do very little against outsiders. For the last 2 years, the new fishery has been jointly managed by an agreement between Australia and New Zealand, with the bulk of the catch going to Australia. But both countries had agreed to close the ground during the spawning season. By the end of June, it should have been deserted. But it wasn't.
There he is. I've got him on the recorder. And there's another one showing those slack hole there.
Right on top of the breeding hill, and just 4 nautical miles outside the Australian border, were 3 80-metre trawlers.
Okay, there is a little name at the front, isn't it?
Right, we've just seen the Coast Watch surveillance.
It took Australia a while to establish that the boats were South African.
The other point is they are there right on the spawning, the time the fish spawn. So you're taking that biomass out of your spawning stock, which then has the knock-on impact of recruitment in future years.